Hi, this is Darkin. I'm a concept artist and a freelance illustrator, and I've been working in the gaming industry for about 6 years now, mainly on Magic the Gathering, World of Warcraft, and Warhammer. And this time I wanted to do a tutorial that's a little more involved than the previous tutorial I did. I wanted to have an actual illustration so I could talk about composition, lighting, eye flow, and also talk about composing an illustration with multiple figures. I also wanted to take some questions from the general audience, so I'm going to be answering those questions during the tutorial. If you noticed earlier when I started at Photoshop, I'm working at 300 dpi, and the tallest side is around 6,000 pixels, and I'm working in Photoshop CS3. So whenever I start out an illustration, I always start out by filling the entire canvas with a middle tone gray, and you can quick fill that by hitting Alt and then delete, and that'll fill it with the foreground color. And then I just pick a big texture brush and I just start laying in different shapes and values just so I can have something to paint on top of. Right now I'm using the hard ground brush for painting. It's pretty much just a Photoshop default that I always use, and I use that for the majority of the entire painting. And if you want to see the brush settings for it, you just go up here to this little icon, click on it, and I have the shape dynamics set to a little bit of a size jitter. So my minimum diameter is set at 70%, and I also have other dynamics set to pin pressure for both of them. The reason I have those little exclamation mark warning signs is because I don't have my tablet plugged in right now. And if you look up here, you'll notice that my flow and opacity are both set to 100%. So I'm actually getting my opacity changed just by the amount of pressure that I'm pushing on my tablet. If you've ever watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I don't really have any preliminary sketches or drawings or anything that I do. I kind of just start my painting and try to figure out what I'm going to paint as I go along. For this one, I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to paint. I wanted to paint a little bit of a battle scene with some medieval knights, but fantasy medieval knights, not historical. So I'm not really sure about the composition, but I'm kind of just playing around, just trying to figure things out. So I'm sketching around a little bit and flipping the canvas. And to flip the canvas, I actually made it a shortcut so that it's just Command F for my Mac, and the equivalent could be Control F for PC. And the reason I just do that is so that I can flip quickly back and forth so that I can check my errors in my drawing. So I'm still just using the hard round brush, and I'm trying to sketch in the main character. I had the idea that maybe he's on horseback and that he's rearing back with a weapon, about to strike his opponent in front of him. I also knew that I wanted to have the light source coming from behind him, so that bright spot on the canvas in the upper right, that's going to be the main light source. So he's going to be backlit a lot. So I'm still not really liking the position of his arm and hand, so I'm just going to delete that. I'm also still not really sure about the armor design yet. I'm still trying to figure that out as I go. So right now I'm changing the position of his face. I was thinking that it might be better if he has his head pulled back and he's looking down at his opponent. I was thinking maybe it'd be a little more dynamic that way. Just give it a little bit more movement. I'm still playing around with the arm position. So when I'm playing around with these arm positions, I'm also thinking about the composition of the piece. I'm trying to think of different diagonals that I can put into my painting just so that it can lead the eye around the canvas. I also want to make sure that I'm not creating any bad tangents or anything. Actually, I lied. I did kind of know what kind of composition I wanted to do because I knew that my canvas had to be 1,000 pixels wide and 1,500 pixels tall in terms of aspect ratio, and that's actually the aspect ratio for the screen of an iPhone. And the reason is because I was doing this illustration for an iPhone app that I'm coming out with. So I already knew that I had to have a vertical composition. And a lot of times vertical compositions are hard for me just to get everything in there that I want with a good composition. So I'm changing his arm and his face again. I'm thinking maybe if he's looking more at the viewer, it'd be a little more engaging. And it might also be a little more unsettling since he's looking at you and raising his weapon. So that way it kind of pulls you into the piece as if you were actually at the battle scene. Before I get too far into this guy, I need to kind of figure out what the rest of the composition is going to be. So I'm just sketching in a figure in the super foreground, just so that I can have a lot of different elements in terms of planes. So I can have a background, a middle ground, and a foreground. And having those different types of things will give your painting more depth. I'm still changing the angle of his face, so I'm just painting that out. That's one thing you need to learn when you're an illustrator is that don't be afraid to make major changes in your painting. So that's one of the good things about sketching loosely in the beginning is that you're not as concerned with just completely deleting an entire area, since, it only took you maybe a minute or two to actually paint that part. So don't get too comfortable with your painting. Because I've seen it a lot of times where people really like something in their painting, but it doesn't work for one reason or another, but they don't want to actually change it because, they're just so attached to it. So just don't get too attached to things. So now I'm thinking that maybe he's holding this big shield in his hand. That might be a good way to separate him from the figures in the foreground. It can be a nice big element too for the viewer's eye to rest on. You don't want to have your composition too busy and crazy because people need to have their eye rest somewhere. So I'm just selecting this with the marquee tool and then moving it up. I'm going to paint out the part that I messed up. That's one of the ways I work, is that I push and pull my shapes in my painting. Like I'll paint something in, and then I'll paint it back out, and then I'll paint something else in, and then I'll paint the background in around it. So it's a big push and pull process. And now I'm trying to position the head of the horse. So at the beginning, I'm not really worried about any type of details. I'm just trying to get the basic composition and forms in place. Don't get too bogged down early on with the details, because then you'll end up probably creating a painting that doesn't work very well, because the elements might not be in the right place, or your proportions may be off. That's one of the other reasons that I worked zoomed out. That way I can see the entire painting and see how all the elements relate to each other. If you work zoomed in, you may create something really cool, and then when you zoom out, it's completely off. Like, maybe if you're working on a hand, it looks awesome up close, but then you zoom out and it's like super tiny, so you have to resize it and just go through this process of fixing things. Right now I'm going back and making my canvas size a little bit smaller so that I can flip my canvas and just do things a little bit faster so that my computer isn't as slow. And at these early stages, you can kind of work a little bit of a lower res, because it's not going to matter as much, because you're going to go through the painting and probably resize it later. So right here I'm just looking at things, trying to figure out what the horse's head should look like and the angle of the horse's head. I'm thinking it might be cool if he has these fiery eyes and maybe fire coming out of his nose too. I was thinking of kind of an undead horse. I'm not really working with any reference, so I'm trying to remember what a horse's head looks like from my memory. And it's a little tough because horses are kind of hard to draw from your memory. So I didn't really like the position of his head, so I'm selecting it and moving it up and over a little bit. I need some more room for his neck. I wanted to be able to show his neck armor, and it just looked like the rider wasn't sitting on his back correctly. I want to start pushing my values a little more, so I'm going in with a darker color. Just want to reinforce the drawing of the horse too, because it was getting lost a little bit. So the same as with the rest of the illustration, I'm not really sure what the horse armor should look like, so I'm just kind of sketching around, trying to find some basic shapes and ideas, and maybe I'll think of something as I'm drawing it. I'm going back and reinforcing some of the darks in the rider. When I'm working in black and white, or actually when I'm just working period, I tend to stay a little bit in the middle keys, so I don't have a lot of brights and I don't have a lot of darks, so I always have to go back in and put those in at the end. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm just going in and pushing my values on both ends of the scale. So another thing for this composition, I wanted to have a lot of loaded edges. And loaded edges are just when you have things that are cropping off either the sides or the top of the image. So I wanted to have this pretty zoomed in on the battle scene, up close and personal, kind of like documentary style filming. So that it puts you right in on the action, and that you're not just some observer from, 100 feet away, or probably more than that, but. So I selected the horse's head, and I actually did a copy merged, which is Command-Shift-C for Macs or Control-Shift-C for PCs. And what that'll do is it'll take your selection and it'll copy it as if your image was flattened. So it'll take all the layers within that selection and copy it so that you can paste it into one flattened version. And after I do that, I did distort, but I didn't really like how it was turning out, so I'm just gonna go ahead and completely redo the horse's head. So I'm just painting it back out and painting it back in, thinking maybe the horse is looking more at the viewer as well. But already I can tell that's not really gonna work. I mean, compositionally, it's pretty boring, and it just mirrors the writer's face too much. So yeah, I'm already selecting it and moving it. It's like what I was saying earlier, don't be too attached to your drawing. Just if you want to make a change or you need to make a change, just go ahead and do it. Don't worry about doing the extra work, because in the end it'll probably pay off. Then I'm going back and looking at some of the different versions that I had, trying to figure out which one works best that I can start fleshing out a little bit more. I tend to keep things on layers just so that I can flip back and forth through the different versions, because I don't really have any pre-planned ideas or any preliminary sketches, so I need to keep these different versions so I can figure out what I'm going to do. I'm thinking maybe I should move the rider up, because there's no way that he was actually riding on that horse, because he was way too low in the saddle. So this way I can also have a good negative space between his arm and the top of the horse's head. So it's just another little compositional element that I'm trying to bring in. And if you feel that a part of your painting is way too heavy, try thinking about how you can add in some negative space, because that'll usually help your painting breathe a little more. Plus it'll, add a little bits of interest here and there. So I'm also using this texture brush that I got from one of my coworkers, and I really like using it in the preliminary sketch stage, because it's a really textury, sketchy brush that kind of mimics natural medium a little bit. You can see it there. The only thing is, when it's larger, it tends to slow down a lot. So now I'm just blocking in some basic shapes of forms in the background. Just putting in some light that's hitting them from the top, just to pull out their form a little bit. Now these figures in the background, I'm not gonna really refine them very much in the actual final painting. They're just gonna be more of hints and suggestions of the background. A lot of times I'll get to a point in my painting where I'm not really sure what I want to work on, or just how I want the painting to look, so I'll just kind of scribble around on random pieces until I get an idea of what I want to work on. So I'm just kind of noodling around with the shape, not really sure what I want to work on. Putting in hints and suggestions here and there. Just looking things over a little bit. So I had this idea that maybe his shield is up higher, because the way I had it wasn't really very dynamic. I mean, he's drawing back his sword, but his shield is just kind of like blah, just like hanging there. So I was thinking if I raised it up, it would help with the movement, and it would also help with the composition as well. I'm also thinking that maybe his arm is down instead of up. So I'm just going to try that out quickly. That's one of the great things about working digitally, is you can make major changes like this very quickly and easily. So it really allows you to try things that you would be too afraid to try if you are working traditionally. So don't be afraid to try new things. If you think, hey, maybe this would look better with his arm down, then just go ahead and try it, because it's not going to take very long to do it. A lot of times when you try things like that, you'll end up coming up with something that you like and that works a lot better for the illustration. So if you notice the angle of his sword and the angle of the guy and his shield in the foreground, they both are running pretty much parallel. So I'm not really sure if I like that compositionally, but we'll see. Just trying to rough in the shield a little bit. I'm not sure if I want to make it a round shield or maybe play around with the shape a little bit. Also trying to think about the armor design of the main character. And I'm also starting to establish my basic lighting scheme. So I want to have this area around here under the shield pretty dark. I was thinking maybe a lot of the light is hitting the shield as well. Still not sure about design, so scribbling around, trying to figure stuff out. Also, the scribbling around kind of helps with, I guess, the texture of the painting as well. It can give more interest visually instead of everything just being like solid colors. So here I'm trying to figure out the saddle. Putting in some dents and some damage in his shield. So you'll notice too that I work around the entire canvas a lot. I usually don't spend very long in one area. I'm thinking maybe something should be coming off of his head, so maybe he should be wearing a helmet just to add some more visual interest and a better silhouette. Alright, so here I jumped ahead a little bit just because I forgot to hit film when I was painting. So, as you'll notice, I have a lot more of the actual character design nailed down. And I also changed the position of the horse's head so that he's looking off in the opposite direction that the main character is looking in. Thinking that maybe that might be a cool compositional element to have the horse's head going in a different direction just to add a little bit more of a dynamic feel, but it doesn't really make that much sense because the horse's head is a complete profile and the guy is actually coming towards you, so I don't think that really works compositionally and just practically. So these things I'm adding like some little metal bits that are dangling off his pauldrons. I like to add a lot of little dangly things just to add interest and just to push the silhouette and break the shape. And another thing I added was I added the sword of the guy in the super foreground so that it's cutting across a lot of the elements of the main figure. And overlapping shapes like that will help push your depth as well. So don't be afraid to paint things on top of your already painted main figure. And that's one of the things that I had a lot of problems with, is I would always have elements dodging the main figure, like going around it, because I just didn't want to put something on top of this thing that I spent a lot of time painting, which actually ended up flattening my paintings out a lot because everything was dodging everything else and nothing intersected. So I wanted to add this big ponytail on top of his head just as another compositional element to break the frame, to make it a little more dynamic. And also hair is a good way to get some movement into your painting. I'm thinking maybe that part of his head is metal for his helmet and then part of his head is actually skin, and that maybe they're kind of melded together. Just putting some light that's hitting the rim down here. Oh, you'll notice too that I have part of the shield lit and then part of it in shadow. And I like doing things like that just to add a little bit of more depth to as well. Just try and figure out some interesting lighting patterns. You know, it doesn't really matter what's making that shadow on his shield, it just adds some visual interest. And the direction of the shadow actually leads your eye right to his face. So also think about that as well. So lighting can not only be, cool lighting effects, but it can also be compositional elements as well. Oh yeah, there are a few things that I forgot to mention at the beginning of the tutorial. Everything you're seeing is filmed in real time, so nothing is sped up. And that was really important to me because you see a lot of videos that are sped up at incredible speeds, so you can't even really tell what's going on or, what the artist is doing. Like, what kind of layers is he working in? What kind of brushes is he using? So I really wanted to break that down and show everything in real time. And also just so you can get an idea of how fast I paint or how much time I spend like just looking over an image and trying to figure out if things look okay. So right here I just added an adjustment layer by clicking the little half black, half white circle on the layers palette menu. And once you click that, you'll get a drop down of all the different options, and I chose layer or levels, and that way I can just easily tweak the darkness and lightness of my image. So I wanted to add more darks to it. Right now I'm going back to the face and I'm completely reworking it. I'm thinking maybe it has more of an organic feel and that maybe it's not so much of a helmet but more of just his face that's been fused with metal, I guess. But that he has these, flaming openings, with his mouth and his nose and eye, and maybe one eye is just completely gone. And it's just been fused over with metal. So over here I'm going in and just roughing in some different plates for his pauldrons. Now, as I work more and more on this guy, I'm noticing that I'm getting more of this kind of a mixed genre feel to it, I guess. I mean, it's almost kind of like a post-apocalyptic but fantasy at the same time. I guess just with the way the face is, and just some of the fur elements mixed with the metal elements, and just the random bits and pieces that he's kind of collected over the years to forge together into pieces of armor. I don't know. Actually, there's even a little bit of a sci-fi feel to it, but maybe that's just because of the glowing eyes or something. I don't know. Glowy bits always seem to make things a little more sci-fi. Because, in the future, everything glows, because it's just awesome that way. So right now I pretty much have a lot of my elements in place, so I'm just going in and trying to think more about actual design and just trying to render things out a little bit more before I start adding color. And I pretty much always start in black and white and add color later through different types of layers and opaque painting. And just the reason I start in black and white is because it's a lot easier for me to just dive into a painting and not worry about what the color scheme's gonna be. I think it's just because I have a lot of work that I have to do, so I can't spend a lot of time sitting around thinking of what I should paint, because I'm already sitting around thinking about what I'm actually going to paint in the painting, so I don't need to sit around thinking of what the colors should be as well. So I just need to start painting just out of a necessity to do more work faster. So I also had this idea that maybe he has these horns like growing out of his head just to make it a little more interesting. I'm just looking things over. So I have this big like strap with a huge belt buckle that's going across his chest. I don't know, maybe this belt is holding on his pauldron, or maybe it's holding his cloak on. I don't know. That's one of the other things I learned when I became a concept artist, is that I started to think a lot more about how things are actually attached, like how armor actually works, and how does it stay on your shoulder? It's probably going to have some kind of straps here and there. So little things like that will help sell your image and make it a little more believable. Yeah, I'm not really sure about this horse's head again, so I'm going to paint that out. Probably going to redo it. So over here I'm just trying to add some hints of the rider's legs. And pushing some more contrast and lighting in the horse. So I'm going back and having his head look a little more towards the viewer again. The other way was just too extreme, I think. So I think I've painted the horse's head in this angle like 3 or 4 times now. And I still want to have something overlapping with that sword in the foreground, so maybe the horse will have some huge spikes on his head, and that'll cause the overlap. Because right now the angle of the horse's head and the angle of the sword, they're almost identical. So that's not very good compositionally. It flattens things out because it looks like they're on the same plane now. So I need to add some sort of overlap later, just to help sell the guy in the foreground is actually in the foreground. I'm still playing around with fire coming out of the horse's eyes and mouth. So yeah, I flip the image a lot. I probably flip it way too much. If you noticed right there, when the edit button was flashing a lot, I was hitting undo, and I have that set to Command Z. And if you look down in the bottom right, you can actually see my history, so you can kind of follow along as to what I'm actually doing in the painting. So I just flip the canvas, and now you can see I'm painting. So yeah, I'm adding in that spike so that I can have that overlapping element. So just adding that one little thing in, you can tell that it helps push the depth of the piece. Because now you can tell, oh, that sword in the front is actually in front of the horse's head. So I'm just pulling out some highlights here and there. Still not really sure about the actual design. So I'm adding in some more elements in the background. Adding in some guys with weapons, and I'm adding in this flag back here. Just little details like that will help sell your image. I added some more interest too. Like these guys in the background, I'm not gonna do anything more than just probably a couple different values to suggest what they are. So this like gray with the strong highlight, that's probably gonna be the extent of how much I render them. Now I'm getting into the heart of the painting, and that's adding color. Yay! So if you look, you'll notice that I added a new layer, and I selected overlay. And overlay is actually like a combination of multiply and screen. And I think it multiplies the lights but screens the darks. It's actually easier just to go through the different layer options and play around with them and see what kind of results you can get instead of trying to understand it in technical terms. I mean, the technical terms help in deciding what layer to use, but it's just easier to experiment. So now I'm just flipping back and forth looking at the different layers that I have. This one right here is multiply, but I'm not really sure I want the background sky color to be that dark. And This one I actually had from earlier. I had forgotten to hit record again, so I had this colored version, and I'm just trying to get back to the same kind of look and feel. So I'm just gonna go back and put in some brighter brights in the background. Again, I'm not really sure what kind of color scheme I want to do, so that's kind of the reason I'm doing like a sepia tone, just so I can start getting some things down and try and think of what I want to do for a color scheme. I tend to use a lot of browns. I think that's kind of my fallback. So on this shield over here, I'm going to try and add in some lights. Just trying to get the brush strokes right. I'm using a chalk type brush. And I'm also trying to figure out how to do the skin color of the guy, but I don't really like how that's turning out. Thinking maybe I can just kind of put this color all around the painting, just to give it some more harmony later on. Now I'm going back to the hard round brush. And if you'll notice, I'm still on the overlay layer. I'm just trying to add in some of the lights. Whenever I'm working on an overlay layer, that's usually when I start trying to push my darks and my lights in my painting. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm going in and just reinforcing some of the shadows. Trying to pull out some forms of the armor a little bit. Now I'm trying not to go too dark. I'm only adding some darks in a few key areas. Just places where the shadows are going to be the darkest, like inside of the armor, where his neck is, yeah, like right under the shield. Then I can go in and start playing with the values a little bit of my painting. And here I'm adding a soft light layer, and I'm going to pick a pretty bright color to paint into the background. Just adding in kind of like a sun effect. Just have the light coming straight down and across. I'm going to put it in the background too. I want the background to be lighter as you go farther and farther away. The soft light layer is a good layer to add lighting effects like glows and sunlight and things like that. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to do another adjustment layer, and I'm going to use color balance, and I'm just going to try and play around with the colors to see if I can come up with something a little bit better. I'm actually going to completely change my color scheme in a little bit and make it blue, and I'm going to do a complementary color scheme with blue and orange, and I was going to have orange be the firelight from his sword. So I'm actually going to show you how to do quick and easy fire that I stole the process from Steve Argyle. So you have to thank him for this awesome fire easiness, and it's magical. Quite magical. Okay, first what you want to do is you want to create a group and then select that group, and from the mode, select screen. Then you're going to add 2 layers inside. And the first layer you're going to fill it with solid black. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to do an adjustment layer and make a gradient map. And I have this little preset uh, fire gradient map that I always use. Basically, you just make it so that one end is completely black, and then in the middle is orange, and then the other end is yellow. And then you go to the second layer that you had made, and you're going to paint in white. And whatever you paint in white, that's what's going to come out as fire. So you can see here I'm just adjusting the gradient map a little bit. And if you have some cool fire custom brushes, then this is a good time to use them. So as you can see, it's pretty quick and easy to get some fire effects going. And I'm erasing some of it out a little bit. And I'm erasing out the sword tip and the hair because I want those to be in front of the flaming fire. The flaming sword, I mean. I'm going to go ahead and start answering some of the questions that I received from the public. And it's actually kind of funny because almost all the questions had to deal with color, which I always considered my weakest point. But I'm just going to go ahead and try and answer these as best as I can. And this one is from Josh Wilson, and he says, I would love to hear as much as you can say about color and light in general. In this piece, is your color based on intuition and feel, or something pre-planned? Or is it a mix of both? If it's intuition, how long did it take to get to that point, and what did you do to get there? I love the glow you have going on in the fire sword, and would enjoy hearing how you created that effect. And to follow up, how did you handle the light source it created and decide where the light would fall on the characters? So for determining where the firelight is going to hit the character, usually around the light source you're going to have this radius of an area where you have the things being affected by the firelight, and the further and further away you get from that, the less the light's going to affect it. So I usually try and imagine there's like this imaginary bubble around where the light source is, and inside that bubble is where things are going to be affected the most by the light. So for this guy, I just wanted to have the light hitting some of the pieces of armor on his arm and on his shoulder, and just the edges that are closest to the firelight, I wanted to rim that in the lighting. And like the little dangly bits that are flopping around, I wanted to have parts of those being hit by the light and then parts in shadow, just to add some more interest to it. And I'm also going in and I created kind of like a lava type arm with the fire, just to make it a little more interesting. Like there's, like his arm, there's cracks of lava coming out. And I'm also going in with a soft light layer and just adding a little bit of a glow coming around the sword and the arm, and a little bit on where it's hitting the armor. And I also want to have the light hitting the side of his face, just so that there's a little bit of a rim light on his face. And I think that was getting a little bit too strong, so I'm going to try and go in and redo it. For the other part of the question, I hardly ever pre-plan a color scheme, so most of it's just intuition, I guess, or just me sitting there, like, playing around with colors and changing things and redoing things until I finally get something that I like. And how long it took me to get to that point, I mean, I've been working professionally for 6 years now, and I still am not very good at color, and I still have a lot of problems with it. So, I mean, I'm still learning. And the way I learned is I've just been looking at a lot of other people's colors and trying to figure out why they did that and why it works. And also just looking at things in nature. That helps a lot. So just going back and talking about this for a little bit, I made the glow inside of his mouth and eyes and nose like kind of a teal color, I guess. And I was thinking that maybe that would be a good contrast to the flaming sword, but I don't know. And so right now I'm changing the color of his head because it didn't really match the rest of his environment. So I'm going in and I'm adding some more cyan and blue just to make it match a little bit more. And now I'm creating a new layer and making it color dodge. And I'm picking a dark neutral color and painting it in sloppily with the airbrush. And the reason I chose the dark neutral color is so that I wouldn't overexpose the painting too quickly. And now I'm picking a lighter color because I want to add a strong light on this head from the fire. I'm just adding those to the spikes too a little bit. You'll notice that my painting is still really loose. The next question is from Loathsome, and he says, could you go into a little bit more detail on how you color tone paintings? I usually get lost in this stage and I don't really get the color right. And thinking of color right away is too much for me in the beginning of the painting. What can be colored from black and white and what must be colored only by color? How do you do this so it gets accurate? That is actually a tough thing to do correctly, because once you get your values established in the black and white painting, a lot of times when you switch to color, your values end up completely changing. So it's hard trying to get the balance of getting your black and white values to stay the same as the color values. And it also depends on what type of layer you're using to add color. If you're just using the color layer to add color to a black and white, then you have to really pay attention to the natural value of a color. For example, let's say you have a light sky in your values in your black and white painting, but you decide you want the sky to be red, like a dark red, and you try to do that through a color layer. If you try and do that, you're going to end up with like a pink sky because the value of red is actually pretty dark. But if you start with a light value and then try and add red on top of it, it's just going to turn out like a weird pink color. So you're going to have to go and try and use different types of layers, like maybe multiply would be better in that type of situation. But if you use like multiply or overlay or those types of layers, those are going to change your values a lot. So, you kind of have to balance getting the colors right and sticking to your original values. I think that's why a lot of times I don't spend too much time on the black and white part, because I know that my values are going to end up changing. I mean, the easiest or the closest way to get your values to match is using the color mode. But, that's hard because the colors always end up looking really weird. So now I'm just going back and I'm trying to just flesh out some of the things on his face, like these spikes. Now what I'm thinking about is trying to figure out how these actually interact with the skin on his head. So I'm trying to think about how the skin will wrap around these spikes just to make it look a little more believable. And if you notice, the eyedropper tool pops up a lot, and I just have that bound to a key on my tablet. You can go to the tablet settings in the control panel and just set your shortcuts to whatever you want. And the eyedropper tool is Alt on the keyboard. So you can see I'm selecting the background color and I'm painting back into the spike just to cut out the edges around it and make it a little more sharp. And I do that a lot. I do the back and forth painting where I'll paint and then I'll select the background color and then paint back over the object. And I just do a lot of pushing and pulling that way. So even these little wrinkles of skin, you have to think about form. There's going to be a shadow side and a light side, and you're going to have highlights. Even small little things like that, you have to think about, what the form is and how to render that. So I'm going to go in and pick a really desaturated yellow because I'm working with the complementary color scheme with the yellow and the purple. And I'm just putting this in with a texture brush, trying to render out the shield a little more, trying to put some light bouncing in on this other side just to give the shield a little bit more form. And then putting in that big bright specular highlight. I'm also trying to put in little hints of damage and rust, and just to show that this shield is battle worn, just to give it that little authentic feel to it. It's one of the things I like to do with a lot of my armor is I like to put in nicks and splits from when weapons hit it, just to give it some realism. So I'm just checking things out. I usually work zoomed out a lot just so I can check to see how things are relating to each other. Now I'm trying to go in and paint the leather of the strap. I'm not really sure about the color of that leather right now. It looks kind of too yellowish, I think. I'm gonna have to go back in and change that in a little bit. I don't know if you noticed this, but I also switched brushes again, and I went to the chalk brush that has a lot of texture to it. And whenever I'm painting belts or straps or things like that, I tend to use the flat brushes for that, just because I can paint the entire belt pretty much with one big stroke if I wanted to. I mean, a lot of times when I'm painting big flat objects, I'll go with that flat brush just because it lends itself well to that shape. So here I'm just painting in the saddle, and I'm color picking from the other parts of the armor that I've already painted, just so that it has the same types of colors in it. And I'm going in and adding in those pieces of damage. This belt buckle was catching a little bit too much light, so I'm just pushing that back a little bit. And adding the shadows under the buckles. Now this top edge of the saddle is going to catch light, and it's also going to catch some of the firelight. So I'm just putting that in. And I'm not going to put it across the entire top, just only the part that's closest to the fire. So I'm just looking things over, just trying to see how things relate to each other and trying to figure out what I want to work on next. And I was thinking that maybe it might be cool if his arm has like these little pieces of chunks like flying off as well, like maybe the lava is causing parts of his arm to break off and just fly around. Give it a little bit of interest, and then the little chunks are going to have, they're going to be catching the light from the fire as well. So for those dangly bits, I was putting in some more purple for the shadows, just to play against the complementary color scheme. Now these armor plates over here, I'm making those a lot lighter than the plates on the opposite side just because they're closer to the firelight. And I'm painting them in like a desaturated yellow orangish color. And since the arm is going away from him, I also want to push that back by making sure that there's less contrast. And in doing that, you can give your figure more depth, even though it probably wouldn't have that much atmospheric perspective in it. But it looks cool just to be able to push a figure into the distance by dropping the contrast on parts. So I don't know if I really like the purple color scheme, so I'm going back through my layers and I'm just turning them on and off, trying to see if I can come up with something a little better. That's one of the good things about keeping these other layers, is I can go back if I want to and make changes pretty easily. I'm thinking maybe the one with more browns I like a lot better, which is pretty typical because I work with a lot of brown color palettes. I don't know, for some reason I just always like the color brown, so I tend to go for the brown color palette. So here I'm making his head a lot brighter just because it was getting a little lost, I think. I wanted to have that contrast of the bright skin next to the dark armor. So I'm just trying to come up with some interesting shadow shapes with the spikes casting some shadows across his head. Just adding that shadow again. The other cool thing about these shadows is it can describe the form of his head. Just by doing that simple little shadow, you can tell the way the head is wrapping around. And adding another spike over there. I'm not sure. I think I like a little bit smaller. But I don't know. I actually kind of like the asymmetrical spikes on his head. I don't want to make it too symmetrical, so I just deleted it. And here I'm adding the light from his mouth, just hitting on the edge of that pauldron. I'm still not sure about the teal color though. I'm adding this negative space over here just so that you can see where the back of his leg is, and just to give it a little more interest and let the piece breathe a little bit so it's not so heavy on that right side. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I was thinking for the composition of this piece. So I'm just going to create a new layer, and I'm going to use a red color just so you can see what I'm talking about. And most of the time when you're doing compositions, you don't want to have something right in the middle of your illustration unless you're trying to make a point. I mean, there are some compositions that do have the main focus in the center, but typically you want to have things kind of off to the side. Your eye is naturally drawn to the upper and lower parts of an image. So there are different rules for compositions. There's the rule of thirds, and basically you just divide your canvas into thirds. That's close enough. Usually the areas around here are good areas to put some focal points, just so that they aren't dead in the center of the illustration. So I'm just going to delete those. And there's also the golden ratio, and it's pretty much that if you just take a square and then you make another square, and then with what's left over you make another square, and you just keep doing that, and it just kind of spirals around like this. So that pretty much covers the placement a little bit of what I was thinking about for this guy. Now I wanted to have a lot of different diagonals in this piece, and most of the time you don't want to have your main figure looking off the canvas, just because it'll bring your eye out of the picture plane. But even though I have this guy looking this way, I still have his shield here to kind of block your eye from leaving the picture plane, and it kind of leads you down here to where these guys are, and you'll hit their weapons, which go this way, and then you'll have the horse's head. Then you have the weapon that goes up here, and then the hair that carries you back around. So you have this kind of a circular movement that keeps your eye moving around to different parts of your image. And once you get to those different spots, you have something to look at. You have the guy, and then you have the shield here, and then you go down, you have this guy over here, and you kind of follow his weapon over, and you have this other guy here, and you have the horse's head. So, and then you have his sword over here. So once you get to all these spots, you have something interesting to look at that all leads you back to the main figure, which is your focal point. Another thing you want to think about when you're designing your composition is that you want to have a lot of depth in your painting. Well, you might not always want to have a lot of depth, but I always try and achieve a lot of depth. And the way you do that is you have things in the foreground, middle ground, and background. So I try and divide my composition so that I have things in all three of these planes. And this one you have these two guys here in the foreground, and they're really close to the camera, so if you want you can kind of just blur them out since they're not really the main focal point. Then you have the middle ground, and the main character is going to be in the middle ground, and he's right here, and the horse as well. And then for the background you have the army, and you have some flags, and you have this other flag. And so those are the three planes. Another thing I want to talk about when talking about composition is that you want to have things that are going in different directions, just so that you have a variety, and just so that things don't look so planned out. So you want to make it a little more random. So I have the main guy looking in this direction, and I knew I didn't want to have the horse looking in the same direction because it would just pull everything to the side. So I wanted to have the horse looking in the opposite direction. The same goes with the other long elements. Since this one's going in this direction, I knew I wanted to have his sword going in the opposite direction, and it also kind of creates this X composition right here. Another thing you want to think about is that you want to have overlapping elements like I talked about earlier. I always hesitate to put things overlapping the main character just because I'm too scared to, but it'll actually hurt your composition because it'll flatten things out. So you want to make sure that some things are going over other things, like this horse's horn here is behind the sword here, and this sword over here is in front of this sword. So you can see it gives it more depth and believability that these people are actually in the same plane. I know a lot of times people spend so much time rendering something that they don't want to hide any part of it, so they'll end up having, this guy here, and they won't put anything in front of him. So they'll have this guy here and his horse, and they'll have some elements over here, and then some more over here. and then they'll have some stuff over here, and it'll create this kind of frame that just frames the main figure, and it just totally flattens everything out. So I'm just working on these little chunks a little bit more, adding in some of the highlights and just darkening the shadows. And I'm going to add some more over here just because there needed to be a few more pieces flying around. And adding little flying bits like this is a good way to add some realism and some movement into your piece. It's kind of a quick little solution to make your piece more dynamic. Just add stuff flying around and dust. Oh, yeah. So, you notice there that my image shrunk down really tiny. That's because I'm using those little buttons near the navigator to zoom in and out, and I got used to using those because on my tablet PC it's hard to zoom in and out since there's no onboard keyboard or anything. So I just always use that to zoom in and out, and so I just end up using it when I'm on my PC or on my Mac as well, just because I'm so used to doing it. But sometimes I accidentally hit where the slider is, and it either zooms out super tiny or it zooms in really large, so it's kind of a pain. Right now I'm searching around for a texture brush, and that's the bad thing about having a bunch of brushes, is you can spend a lot of time trying to search for your brush if you don't know exactly where it is. So I'm trying out this texture brush, just trying to add some more interest to the shield. I'm trying to look for some other ones now. Thinking maybe of like a chalk brush. Just trying some different stuff here. Yeah, I really like using this chalk brush a lot to paint in texture. And now I'm gonna go in and add some rust to his shield. Maybe where some of these damaged parts are, there's some rust coming out of it. I'm just trying to dirty him up a little bit, and also to take some of that orange from the fire and place it around the image just to give it some more harmony. And I'm going to change the color of it as well, just to add more variety of the rust. Like when you're painting something, don't just stick to one color. Try shifting the value and shifting the hue, just to add more interest, not make everything look the same. And I'm going to go in and add some of this blue as well. Taking some of the blue from the background and adding it into the actual figure. Again, I'm just trying to get some more harmony in the piece. I'm not sure how much I want to render his hair, or if I want to leave it a little abstract. So just gonna go in and carve out some of the parts of the background a little more. I always have this hard time of trying to get the right edge control on things in the background as opposed to things in the foreground. So that's one thing that I'm still trying to work on. A lot of times I feel like my image is really fuzzy. So I think I just need to go in and harden some of the lines up a little more. Just trying to add some more of that texture into the flag back there. Just give it a little bit more form. I skipped ahead a little bit and I just added in some of the lights on the armor on the horse's head, and I'm just trying to add in some different light patterns, just trying to find something interesting, and trying to hit some of these lights on the armor on his neck. And I'm also going to go in and add this little rim light to the figures in the foreground just to pull them out a little more, trying to figure out where they should go. Now I'm going back into the shield and working on that a little more. That highlight was a little strong, so I'm just going to go and paint that back out. And I'm going to go in here and just trying to sharpen some of the edges a little more. Just add in some of the shadows and just sharpen his pauldron up. And I'm trying some new texture brushes, but that didn't really work, so I'm gonna go in with the rake tool just to add some cooler brush strokes. Just add some interest and variety in the textures. Just searching around where I can use it, but I'm gonna go back to the round brush again. And I'm just going up here and sharpening more of the edges on the spikes. Painting in the background around it to sharpen it up. Right now the spikes are really flat, so I need to put a little more form in there, so I'm just going to divide it in half and then color pick some of the highlights on his pauldron and paint that in down the middle. And just doing that automatically gives it some form, so you can tell that the spike has shape and isn't just a flat object. And painting in some dents and some of the rust in there too. That's the one thing I like doing with the armor, is just adding in those little dents and nicks and adding in the highlights on those. I usually don't like painting pristine armor. It's just not as fun to me, and just usually just doesn't look as real, I guess. I mean, just to have these knights walking around in pristine armor all the time just seems kind of weird. I'm going to push the darks in these a little bit, and then I'm going to go in and add some more of the firelight hitting it, just to pull out those forms a little more. It seemed like these needed some highlights. And when I'm painting, I'm always looking for things that I can add to make it more interesting, or just to look cooler in terms of design. So I'm thinking that maybe the arm could have some spikes as well. Might be a cool visual element, and I can hit some more of the spikes with the rim light of the fire. So these I'm just using two colors to pull out the forms, just the dark and then the light. I'm working on pulling out some of these shapes on his head and just refining things, and I felt like the head was just a little too boring before, so I'm trying to add in all these wrinkles and having the skin being pulled around the spikes. Just roughening his face up a little more, just to make it look a little more evil and menacing. And if you notice, I'm zoomed in, but I'm not zoomed in all the way. Right now I'm at 66%. I'm just trying to keep it zoomed out as much as possible while still being able to refine things the way I want to. A lot of people tend to zoom in way too much so that the head fills the entire screen, and you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So now I'm going to go in and I'm actually just going to choose a gray to paint these veins on his head. And because of the colors around it, they're actually going to look blue. And that's one of the cool things about using colors, is that you can achieve a color based on the colors around it. Like, something may look blue, but when you color pick it, it's actually not blue at all, but it could be just a desaturated orange or just a gray. I know there's a special term for that, but I just can't remember it at the moment. I'm sure my color and design teacher is shaking her head at me right now. But the important thing is that you know about things like that. Not necessarily that you know the technical name for it, just as long as you understand and that you can actually use some of those elements in your painting. I'm just trying to paint in some highlights on the fur of his cloak. Color picking more stuff from his pauldrons to use for the rest of the painting. Zooming out to see how it looks. Gonna go in and just sharpen these up a little bit more on the spike up here. Gonna add some more blue on the spike too. Just place it around in some other areas on his armor. All of the nicks in the armor and the spikes are all gonna catch light, so don't forget to add that in there too. And I'm using this texture brush, kind of like a chalk brush. I usually use that for painting fur, just because it gives it that sort of gritty, furry feel, I guess. I just don't want it to be so smooth like the round brush can do. And I'm just adding in some negative spaces in the fur just to break things up a little bit. Since I'm doing this illustration for an iPhone app, for those of you that don't have an iPhone, when you have images, you can use them as your background. And you see the background when you first try and log into your iPhone, and the top and bottom are kind of covered up with text. So I'm actually going to go and change the cropping of my image to allow for more space on the top, so that if someone does use this for the background of their iPhone, when they try and log in, the text doesn't completely cover up his face. So I'm just using the crop tool to select everything so that I have the correct aspect ratio, and I'm just moving it straight up. But I accidentally got a little blue on the edge, so I'm redoing it, and I'm holding shift when I move it up just so that I'm sure that I won't move left or right, and that I'll only move up. So now I'm just going in and color picking the background colors and just filling in the parts that are blank. It's pretty boring, so I'm just gonna skip ahead. And now it's all filled in. So hopefully there's enough space on top now so that his face isn't covered up when you log in. Those are the types of things you need to try and keep in mind when you're doing a painting for a client. You know, if you're doing it for a book cover or whatever, just try and make sure that if there's going to be text on it, that your image allows room for that text. I'm playing around with different ideas of having the fiery glow on his shield, and I'm trying to figure out some shapes for that. Yeah, I'm not really sure if I'm liking that right now. I'm thinking maybe I'll go and use it on the fire layer. So I'm just gonna select white, and I'm gonna paint in the shape again. And because of the gradient map and all those other filters I have on, it's gonna come out as a glow. I'm just trying to get the right amount of glow. I think I'm gonna lower the opacity a little bit so I can paint it in more subtly instead of being so heavy-handed about it. And while I'm on this layer, I'm gonna go ahead and try and add some more glows to the other areas, just because it's super quick and easy and too lazy to go paint it all in by hand. So that's the awesomeness of the fire layers. I mean, it's always good to try and find little shortcuts like that, as long as it doesn't compromise the integrity of your painting. Just because the faster you are, the more jobs you're going to be able to take, which is really important for a freelancer since you never really know where your next paycheck is going to come from. And I'm going back in and doing some more of the highlights on the horse's head. Not really highlights, but just where the light is hitting the armor. And I'm trying to think of what the harness is going to look like. And it'll be a good place to add in some leather since there's so much metal everywhere. Now, when I'm painting these straps, I'm constantly thinking of the composition and where everything's laid out, and I'm trying to avoid any tangents, and I'm also trying to add good shapes and good lines, and just try and think of something that flows naturally and looks interesting. I think I repainted the reins like 5 or 6 times just now, and I just kept deleting it and trying again. And that's just one of the things that you need to try and get used to doing is, if you're not happy with something, don't be too lazy to go and change it. Because, I mean, this is so easy with digital medium. Just, hit undo and try it again. I've had people say before, like, whoa, how did you get that line, like, so straight or whatever? And they think that I do it on, like, the first try. No, I mean, I go back and redraw something, like, 5 or 6 times just so that I can get it exactly the way I want it. Like, if I'm trying to draw a straight line, I try not to use any of the line tools because usually it looks too mechanical. So I'll just sit there and draw a line and hit undo and then draw it again. And just keep doing that until I finally get it right. So I'm playing around with the idea of adding the glow in the horse's eyes. That way there's more orange again in other parts of the painting, just so that it ties everything together. This way most of the glow is on the main character, but then your eye will get a second read on the horse's eyes. Playing around with different brushes to try and get the glow effect right. This brush is the brush that I usually use for painting smoke and fog. And see, there again, I'm undoing and painting it again until I get something that I like. Also thinking that maybe it's just a little too corny and too literal to have all this glowy smoke coming out of his eyes. This is probably a good stopping point for the first part, so I'll see you in part 2.